Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is my third book called The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge. It's a novel. It's a novel about me coming to terms with the attempted destruction of an Englishman and his Javanese family. But it is a novel. Yes, it's based on experience. It's based on real people and celebrities, but amalgams of real people or caricatures of them. So if you do identify yourself, please forgive me, because it's only intended as a yarn. What might have been? What am I truly left with? And what do I truly believe? Maybe not much, and then again everything. If everything is in the mind, including the game, its rules and the actions of the elite, then the struggle is once again an internal struggle. But in arguing this, I have erroneously brought the self back to the fore, when the collective consciousness is more important. If all is mental, then of course all is an intellectual game that I have chosen to play rather than abstain from, as Maddie so wisely does. Maddie would not have been so foolish as to wreck her career by exposing conspiracy. Everything I've reported to you has happened and is as real as anything I have experienced. We were poisoned. We did lose our minds. We can identify criminal intent. But as I now know, this merely represents an internal struggle. So do I continue playing this mental game or move back into the game of life? This is a choice we're constantly making to avoid the misery of the game of life. I moved into the intellectual game. Is it now time to move back? Or do my advancing years, the second half of my life, thrust me into contemplating more, including my own death and what I have learned in this life? Maybe our own exploration of consciousness is a necessary precursor to death, as this is merely a construct of consciousness. And why wouldn't this be true if time is also a construct? Or is the exploration creating the energy that our parasites feed off? Despite so many of life's biggest issues being unresolved, I've learned so much. I know that happiness attracts happiness and misery attracts misery. I know that love is the best policy in the long run, the most effective tactic. I've learned to forgive and to release my adversaries, my own son and myself, from the destructiveness of revenge. Maybe I should be content in this, but the awakening I feel is very real. I am beginning to see things much more clearly for what they really are, unclouded by the empty promise of consumerism and politics. I had not given my own very minor role in exposing corruption a second thought after the British press left my doorstep and the immediate anguish had ended. Indeed, until now I had accepted the issue which offended was the ludicrous one the politicians and civil servants had picked on, not the fundamental challenge of having proof of collusion. So ridiculous that it wasn't true. I should have spotted that I was being set up, but still believed the world to be much more honest. It's over a year since I've been contemplating the world, life and afterlife, and revelations now come to me at an alarming rate. Not smoking, drinking, watching television and praying or meditating each day really do open up these dimensions. I believe this is through the pineal gland, but cannot be certain. Do not write this off as New Age nonsense, as few could have been more sceptical than I was. Indeed, I've constantly referred back to Kajawan to avoid being influenced by the New Age and Theosophy. You see, throughout my life, I have moved between art and science, but science has dominated my last 30 years. The old skeptic in me would say, I now have too much time on my hands, hence my thoughts. But what does this really mean? The game is no longer so captivating? Although maybe, if I go back to a time before I drank alcohol, my pineal gland was already opened. But unlike Smith of Wootton Major, those experiences of my childhood I had never given a second thought to until now. Happiness in our warped society is always a promise of the future, and as we approach death, the emptiness of this promise becomes all apparent. My mum clings on to life despite really wanting to deny, because like Jin Khan, she is asking herself, was that all it was? My father busied himself preparing for their deaths, but I cannot sure that he was truly prepared or simply preoccupied, whilst Branwell is contemplating suicide without having contemplated life, nor even begun living. So I now recognise our lives to be like pushing a shopping trolley around an empty mall, surrounded by advertising to create desires for rewards which, even if they exist, never satisfy. When all along we should have approached death and accepted it long before it too happens, but we are too preoccupied with the sticking wheels on our shopping trolley to even consider the more profound aspects of death. But maybe there is another reason for these revelations coming now. It's because I now understand forgiveness and I can cope with such revelations. Throughout my life, every time I have found that reality is not as I had been taught, but somewhat darker and more cynical, I too became somewhat darker and more cynical. At university, I was taught if I could provide evidence of collusion amongst the elite that would stand up in a court of law, then I could change the world. But once I achieved my quest, I found that far from the world changing for the better, that the world was nothing like as honest and logical as I had been taught. No, it's a world of greed, lies and abuse. Had I really comprehended the truth, then it's possible I would have joined the greedy and abusers. Alternatively, I might have completely given myself over to conspiracy theories and the emptiness this brings to our lives. Yes, there are conspiracies and collusions, but do not dwell on them, as there is much more to life. Indeed, focusing on conspiracies is like punishing crimes. It only gives legitimacy to the crimes themselves, focusing on property ownership and our deepest fears. Nietzsche believes we cannot be happy without experiencing sadness. Maybe there is far more to this than the role of the elite in using corruption and collusion to subjugate us is what we can understand true freedom. How to free ourselves from selfishness and greed, thereby removing ourselves from the game. So despite seeking knowledge, maybe there is a logical progression to this knowledge, or principles which must first be understood. Despite me now having flirted with the New Age, why am I reluctant to truly embrace it? Let me reassure you that you will not find our bedroom with dream catchers hanging from the ceiling, nor New Age crystals on display. Even the Jimat and Wafak are gone. Despite my critique of Cartesian rationalism, I refuse to completely abandon it and believe that experimental physics will make many of my new beliefs look naive. Why? Because science, both Newtonian and quantum, provide answers which are simply more believable than superstitions, whether ancient or New Age. And it is the sum total of this belief which makes it real. For science is logical and disciplined, not prone to extremism. It reduces errors and therefore can reduce entropy. Or at least that's the theory. But such is the pressure on academic sciences that this idea has been significantly tarnished over recent years. Even when I worked as an academic, my manager's publications were actually written by a colleague and I. The manager was even made a Life Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts on the basis of our endeavours. Nevertheless, this is the reason why Western medicine's works better than visiting a Dukan. It's more believable and we can feel it working. But make no mistake, everything is a placebo, including the neem oil that I have found so effective with skin cancer and thyme oil with herpes. Unlike superstitions and religion, science has no sacred truths and is devoted to disproving previously held beliefs. No, I love science. Indeed, I remained sceptical when visiting Dukans and Pa Ustad and was the first to expose deceit. Then it was my tireless research which uncovered lead poisoning and not black magic to be behind our underlying problems. This scepticism reveals a degree of ethnocentricity, but I was always ready to back down should my Indonesian family disagree that it was subterfuge I had uncovered. Well, almost always. I believe this to be an important boundary which anthropologists are learning to navigate. Whilst they cannot completely abandon science, they should not impose a scientific interpretation on what others observe. But without contemplating the very boundaries of science in my own often non-scientific manner, then it is not possible to consider the alternatives for humanity. How could there be a better universe or universes? So I refuse to completely dismiss what others will find fanciful. When I have proof that they are untrue, I will abandon them. Of course, by not choosing the scientific method, I explore these concepts, will draw criticism from most scientists. But it's only a game, and this is only a yarn. I never pretend it to be science. However, I do hope that I'm not guilty of borrowing and misrepresenting science to support my theories, scientism, as I have been at pains to validate as best I can any scientific claim I have made, just as when I have been discussing Islam. But then there is so much pseudoscience related to consciousness and within the New Age. Please forgive me if I had inadvertently incorporated a fallacy in my arguments. Of course, science is not a single system of beliefs, but like Islam, a broad masjid. There will be many scientists and Muslims who disagree profoundly with me, but I've tried to keep my thoughts within this broad masjid. But then scientists, along with academics who've been influenced by Karl Popper, play an intellectual game on the casual observer. By necessity, they define the boundaries of their investigation and data. This is a necessity which, as a brain for hire, was always my first task. They then investigate the phenomena and begin to make inductions from their findings without reminding us of these boundaries. Even Carl Sagan, for whom I've a lot of time, defines social programs as political systems, as experiments, because he understood the world through his commitment to the scientific method. When such contradictions are pointed out to an academic, they're quick to berate us that our conclusions do not belong within their specialism. They're unscientific, as though that in itself is a logical argument and not a definition of the limitations. Such is the sleight of hand that much of modern science would not sufficiently follow Karl Popper's logic of scientific discovery, and therefore should not be considered science. Even maths is not immune, as Bertrand Russell showed in his paradox. So when I argue that marketing creates desire, I will be told that I don't understand marketing and that desire comes from our personal psychology. But what this really means is that my argument is outside the boundaries of marketing. That marketing, along with all academic subjects, is so atomized that it is, by its nature, limited. As an academic, I remember having a paper on public sector marketing rejected by a journal for much the same reason, although my argument was far less controversial. But I hadn't followed the marketing orthodoxy and had actually dared to really think about my arguments. Now, this semantic sleight of hand means that voters, citizens, residents, students, and even school children are called customers who consume services dislocated from politics and their rights. Such intellectual betrayals are, however, an essential precursor to the privatisation of the Commonwealth and public good. Indeed, I recall how so much of marketing is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and indeed how it seems to me that Maslow had discovered something profound, that I should aspire to the nobler needs at the apex of the hierarchy. In many respects, this was exactly what Martin was snared by in his desire to leave something good and of value to the world. But is Maslow really so profound? In a world of plenty and not scarcity, is this hierarchy of needs or a hierarchy of greed? So if we use magic or even ask for things in our prayer, we should not ask for our psychological needs to be addressed. Then that we would only aspire for sufficient. In anything else is the realm of black magic. In aspiring for self-actualization, both Martin and I have engaged in the darkest of desires, convincing ourselves that our intentions were truly honourable and that we were good people, but that God has already provided us with all. There is no requirement for Martin nor I to intervene, however well-intentioned we believe ourselves to be. Indulge me for a while, if you will. The last thing I need is another conspiracy theory, and it is not my intention to introduce one. But if there was an esoteric knowledge, wouldn't the atomization of academia be the perfect mechanism for hiding it within its internally rational egregore? The rigid, disciplined boundaries become like the wheel on a hamster's cage, the academic being too preoccupied with the next step to look around the cage, let alone consider the outside of the cage, Plato's cave. Or just maybe that's the point, to keep academics expending energy which our parasites harvest. So what the scientist can find evidence to support evolution all around, which is significant, but fail to see the limited evidence which does not, along with the social and economic influences on Darwin, a hegemony which must have remained pervasive in my own Salopian infancy. The atomization also reflects traits observable within psychopaths. Now, it's not my desire to support the creationist critique of Darwin, simply to suggest that Darwinism is the antithesis of previously deep-held religious beliefs, and we were too quick to totally reject them, as though Darwin invalidates any creator. So I simply feel that now is the time for the synthesis. True knowledge can only come from breaking down these boundaries, uniting physics with metaphysics. So why isn't there a clamour to unite physics and metaphysics? Because herein lies profound knowledge, and academics are by nature conservatives. But this conservatism leads to rejection of knowledge, and therefore academics are inherently ignorant. We are back to Aldous Huxley's concept of the brain as a reducing valve, and therefore our education system teaches us to reject knowledge and to revere ignorance. Why else would academic subjects be so atomised and concerned with policing their boundaries? Lest you believe that my comments are directed specifically at science, let me assure you that the worst culprit of atomisation and drawing tight boundaries is philosophy, which, unlike anthropology, is still hopelessly ethnocentric. Indeed, so much of social science, and certainly management studies, is an attempt to gain respectability as academic subjects, have become more like science, and in doing so abandoning the study of those areas which really matter, which is all along winded way of repeating Gödel's incompetence theorem that everything is both true and untrue at the same time. Of course, Carl Sagan rightly argues science has made our lives so much better and provided us with a vignette of the world of abundance. But in doing so, it has taken us further away from enjoying the world of abundance. I think I should not go far wrong if I asserted that the amount of genuine leisure available in a society is generally in inverse proportion to the amount of labour-saving machinery it employs. E.F. Schumacher. But each wave of technology creates more debt to fund the capital equipment required by production, and debt for consumption to purchase the output of this equipment. This is where the intellectual sleight of hand re-emerges. Scientists rightly argue that science is neutral and how it is used or abused is a political issue, or that science is only as dangerous as the hand which controls it. But then the same could be said of magic. Indeed, isn't science really a form of magic, with its promise that we can control our environment? So the nuclear physicist, the econometrician, the physician are our modern wizards, people with whom we put our faith without the faintest idea of what they're doing. Now, if it were true that science is neutral, how did we create the atomic bomb, nerve gas and military androids? Given that, as Carl Sagan has rightly identified, that we now have the ability to provide abundance, but want has increased, should scientists not be taking more interest in how artificial intelligence and transhumanism is going to be implied? Indeed, is it artificial intelligence or remote decision making, even remote exploitation? Decisions based on hegemony, which already locks us into servitude, and indeed the artificial intelligence then spins its own hegemony. Lest you think such technology is neutral, I remind you of the problems that I have had in leaving the UK, due in part to websites making ethnocentric assumptions. Imagine these, along with assumptions about lifestyles, consumptions and values, the existing hegemony being the basis of artificial intelligence and its replication of hegemony. For without considering the philosophy and ethics of artificial intelligence, even for seemingly mundane commercial applications, we are quite capable of creating an Old Testament God. But the real issue is to address the ideology which makes us want to create destructive technology. Around 1920, our problems had not been producing from our needs, but selling the overproduction. According to Baudelaire, this gave birth to commodity fetishism and ultimately our hyper-reality. So around 1920, we should have called a halt to increasing debt, for we already had all we needed for a healthy life. but marketing preaches to us that it's better consume than not to. The greed is normal and good, or as Walter Sleasley put it, spending money you don't have for things you don't need to impress people you don't like. Should these premises not be challenged before academics define the boundary of the subject? So when I taught business, I used to say that the total marketing cost make up around 40% of any value chain, and now I believe it to be much more. It seems to me that we should not continue to advance technology in the knowledge that we can only be accessed by increasing debt, and we should ask ourselves, what is the function of this debt when we can already supply our needs? Newton's third law is more profound than most physicists consider. For every action, there is an equal opposite reaction, and this applies to all, even to intention. A long time ago, I realised that economic development inevitably means winners and losers. I'm not proposing a zero-sum game, except in its very broadest interpretation, when we include the environment and happiness. But we must understand this reaction, and it was this very principle which led civil senior servants to sacrifice me. So now we have new shopping malls and city centre apartments, but also empty high streets apart from rough sleepers in the doorways, including my own son, Branwell. At the macro level, Indonesia desperately needs infrastructure investment, but this simply opens up more of the economy to the existing economic structure. So with investment, the rich get richer, the trickle-up effect. Yes, the middle class in Jakarta grows, but the poor, whose lands and livelihoods have been taken, generally get poorer. Indeed, all economic development is really a slightly more benign version of the Enclosures Act, redistributing from the poor to the rich. I'm not proposing a zero-sum game, but in today's financially driven economy, even a negative sum game becomes attractive. To increase shareholders' value and therefore equity, possibly prior to disinvestment, it becomes attractive to seek short-term but high returns, without consideration of the long-term, including compensation claims. But economic growth is a statistical trick and simply reflects the ability to define more areas of human endeavour as economic, or more importantly to policymakers, taxable. Indeed, in the West, with the exponential growth in the GDP component of health and legal services, which really measure consumption of these services, GDP growth has become the opposite of personal wealth and happiness. But then what does GDP even measure? After all, in common with so many laws which restrict our liberty, it was a temporary measure introduced to support the war effort. Notionally, GDP measures value added, but value isn't added by health and law. Along with financial services, it erodes value. Indeed, Eric Weinstein argues that after around 1972, technology had made the production of basic goods so inexpensive that those areas of marketing failure are greater than the real economy, supporting my view that total marketing costs are far higher than production costs. So we are now applying rational economic assumptions to economy, which is so far removed from these assumptions that we are simply engaged in spin, while ascending an Escher-like staircase of economic growth. At the same time, the US undermined the Bretton Woods Agreement, meaning that the very way we measure everything is also a product of spin. The current clamour to electronic currency is simply an attempt to continue this spin. After all, how could a computer be wrong? Thus my journey is concluding, as the economy and society itself have become black magic, a black magic which prevents us from coming closer to God's love. Politicians and policymakers, along with those advising them, myself included, have long believed that the end justifies the means. If anything, left-leaning politicians have been the biggest culprits, believing in sacrificing the few for the majority. But this imposition of our beliefs and will on others is at the centre of all that I've been considering, and that is the definition that I have arrived at for black magic. The truth is that the end never justifies the means, but just maybe the means justifies the end. Of course, it is simply a coincidence that the Science Museum's archive and repository, along with those of the other London-based national museums, is opposite the location of the famous Battle of Blythe Road, which leads me to question the relationship between physics and metaphysics. Could it be that physics is simply metaphysics, devoid of some meaning? So too is astrology, astrology, also stripped of its meaning. Chemistry really alchemy, largely devoted to the interests of the petrochemical industry, and therefore Western medicine is healing that has been diverted to serve the petrochemical industry. So does this make doctors little more than salespeople for the petrochemical industry? And our experience with Maddie's psychiatrist certainly confirms this, notwithstanding the psychiatrist's initial good sense probably saved Maddie's life, or at least her mind. Certainly in Branwell's case, it appears to be medicating poverty. Am I going too far? Are you sure? For I can no longer judge, not when I've had some doubts about the 11th of September. My whole concept of truth has gone, for I've ventured too far and too frequently outside Plato's cave. Certainly there are plenty of indications of how magic was becoming more standardised in an attempt to replicate successful spells, especially through grimoires. About a month after I wrote this, I heard from my mother, and her family doctor had, after 10 years, got to the bottom of her problems, prior to a new set of miraculously manifested in themselves. Like me, my mother suffers from variable blood pressure, and like me, she was put on a barrage of medications to control it. But the medications simply reduced it, sometimes to dangerously low levels, hence her fainting, and presumably mine when flying. So my mother has been too frightened and embarrassed to leave the house in case she blacked out, and now she knows the cause, it is too late to reverse her behaviour. The diuretics she has been taking have caused a degree of kidney failure. I am sure this happened to me, and in my case have been exacerbated by lead poisoning. Certainly since moving to Indonesia, I've stopped taking this medication, and far from having a negative reaction, at least in terms of my blood pressure, I seem to be fine. Why did this happen? Because in the UK it was decided to target anybody with slightly raised blood pressure, whether reaction to having their blood pressure taken or simply variable. Indeed, medical practitioners were incentivised to find and medicate such people. My mother and I became medicalised on a range of medications which we and the NHS were to pay for the rest of our lives. So maybe I'm not going too far in calling doctors salespeople for the petrochemical industry. There is another uncanny example of the synchronicity in my writing, which seems to be somewhat methodically resolving all the loose ends in my life, maybe even leading me to the profound knowledge that I've been trained to ignore. Herein lies the real point to my yarn. If you now wish to judge me as insane, for I've spent too long outside the cave, then please do so. For I began this episode by writing that I'm no longer concerned about what you think of me. I emphasise that this was not written in disrespect for you. But if you have not ventured outside the cave, what do you know of the outside? Certainly, I now no longer seek your approval, and am rapidly abandoning seeking the approval of all. I have witnessed and observed things I did not believe possible. I have experienced such incredible emotions of fear and joy that I can no longer talk of truth, only repeat my experiences to you. No, wandering outside the cave, observing what I have and looking for meaning in it are not indicative of insanity. Only repeating it to those inside the cave is insane, and I have foolishly written it down for all to admonish. For the wise woman, man, understands these things and says nothing. She or he keeps it to themselves and appear normal to those who remain inside the cave. I recall as a young boy, maybe 5 years old, I think I was on a school trip, my hair patted down with Vitalis and tie held in place with a green adate clip and the elasticated top to my short trousers. My mother left me with the other boys to visit the ladies' toilets with the other mothers. This was possibly the first time my mother had not taken me into the toilets with her. Certainly the first time I had been left outside with my school friends. I wanted to see inside the ladies' toilet, not to see naked mothers, nor even to venture inside, but to see what was now forbidden to me. So I tried to glimpse into the toilets. I don't believe it was possible to see inside, such was the construction, but the other boys grasped me up. I don't think I was being punished, but embarrassed. It was this same curiosity which set me off on this journey. I wanted to glance outside the cave, but as I always repeated, just a small doubt, just a chink in your beliefs is enough to open up a whole universe which you neither believed in nor desired to be exposed to. I do not ask my friends, neighbours and families to use black magic to put suggestions in my mind. But having done so, I did wander outside the cave and will continue to do so, not because the outside is real, as Plato believed, but because it is as real as the inside. Every time I go outside, I become that little bit more insane, as far as most of you are concerned. But it is to me who is really insane. Or is it the elite who plots against the symbols of American capitalism and sets the followers of the world's two largest religions against each other? When scientists doubt areas they cannot construct a scientific experiment to prove or disprove, areas which are outside the boundaries of science or the confines of the cave, they should really be more honest and say that they don't know but personally doubt it. Such is the nature of God and life after death. I am happy for science to chip away at those areas previously thought to be the preserve of religion. This is knowledge. But to extrapolate that disproving a religious belief means that God does not exist seems to me to be itself unscientific. After all, when a scientific theory is disproved, science becomes stronger. Why should it not be the same for religion? This is even more paradoxical, as when an academic subject is fully considered, it ends up at religion. But then, of course, the boundaries are reintroduced to avoid consideration of what really matters. The same is true of my journey, which I began by considering magic and the paranormal, then its effect on my psychology, and ended up with philosophy and religion. But maybe the likes of Richard Dawkins do science a great disfavour, as if we see science and religion as being unified and not opposed, so many of the arguments I have followed become inconsequential. I initially wrote immaterial, but that's a terrible choice to describe what I mean. One might even call it a Freudian slip. Indeed, theoretical physics has the appearance of the science because it uses maths, the simplest of languages, but like metaphysics or theology, it's really just an exploration of the mind. But then science is by nature reductionist, and what could be more reductionist than distilling everything to an equation? Nevertheless, through its logic and the scientific method, science does provide a prophylactic to Milton's seductive Satan. It's not heresy to believe in evolution, that the world is very old, whatever messianic religious leaders may tell us. But of course, the very word religious leader is a contradiction, especially to us Sunnis. No, heresy is not to believe in God. Indeed, a rejection of knowledge and deifying ignorance moves the person away from God and not towards him or her. Such concepts were at the heart of early Islam. Indeed, Islam gave rise to the scientific method. I will even defend your right to be a heretic, just as I have every right to both seek and submit to Allah. But I am much less inclined to defend your rights to label other heretics, which of course is your right, but I cannot reconcile this being backed up by legislation, whether religious or secular. What I've found is that all explanations are partial, but the magic, science, religion, philosophy and psychology begin to converge. I may never reach a point at which these fully converge and stop seeking the truth, but I'm sure of its trajectory. Just as there are arguments within Islam, these are the points of division where we find profound knowledge, but where they converge. Those of you who have followed each of my episodes will understand now how I have changed my beliefs from scepticism about black magic to believing that anything is possible and probable. I rejected the New Age and Western explanations, believing that the answers to the incredible events which overtook me in Indonesia lay in Java and its Kejawen beliefs. There is even the suggestion that Kejawen was influenced by theosophy, and certainly the urban Kebatian movements such as Subud were influenced it, not least as Dutch colonialists were very active in the theosophy movement. Nevertheless, with theosophy behind so much New Age thinking, and like Kejawen dips into Hindu and Buddhist teachings, my thoughts have coincided and crossed with the New Age should come as no surprise. Indeed, I find that independently I have arrived at some of the same views on religion that are close to those of Madame Helena Blavatsky, which maybe is predictable, given that I have briefly and tentatively trod in her illustrious footsteps. Certainly I have always held Annie Besant, the hero of the Match-Girl strike, with the reverence she commands, although possibly not Mancunian Alice Bailey, darling of the globalists. But I'd wish to distance myself from New Age's dislocation of ideas from their source, including the lack of credit given to theosophy and especially Alice Bailey. Of course, magic was simply a vessel, that I had realised that nothing has meaning or matters, and that it was just a stage in my own consciousness evolving. Why don't I describe reality as a hologram, which along with multiple universes are tied to string theory, that itself is perhaps looking like an intellectual cul-de-sac? Why won't I use the word matrix for the game? Why won't I describe the elite as an Illuminati, a new world order, or another race? Why don't I focus on ancient aliens and modern day UFOs? Why, despite having identified collusion and corruption, do I not focus on it more? Why do I cling on to my beliefs as a Muslim, albeit tinged with Qajar and Islam, partially because none of it really matters? All could simply be ideas which are designed to re-engage us in the gauge. But I'm more sceptical of the ascended masters Madame Helena Blavatsky saw could be a temptation from an internally generated Heathcliff Satan, rather than the Sufis' attempts at a oneness with Allah. Why? Well, for no other reason than the Sufi tradition has been around longer than Theosophy, has many more practitioners, and Sufis spend so much of their time considering this possibility. Although many occultists would argue Allah, God, Jehovah, is a false god, and that followers of the Abrahamic religions are simply being tricked, that the ascended masters are ancient gods, who were venerated much longer than the Abrahamic God. Indeed, I am willing to return to seeing Satan as a construct which makes us most fearful of our other man, and paradoxically in doing so takes us away from a oneness with God, because it is this fear of evil which creates the evil that I believe we are able to define objectively. But I'm willing to continue to submit without entertaining such thoughts. Also, I think because there is an extensive Sufi theology which somewhat lends itself to scientific inquiry, whereas New Age practitioners, and I include in this the UFO, alien abduction, ancient aliens beliefs, so often obscure their influence, and especially that of Theosophy. Maybe one day I will learn to trust myself more whilst resisting the temptation to appear godlike. Returning to my hunch that we constantly move between universes, and that is how we create our environment, then evil really is internal. It exists within us, and if we allow it to dominate our thoughts, our universe reflects this. But if we laugh at those fears which give rise to evil and fill ourselves with unconditional love, then we can move to a universe without fear and evil. Therefore, it really is true that we can create Jerusalem. But there is another reason to keep returning to my Muslim faith, and it is because I've accepted that ultimately I must return to the cave, for no matter how I try, I cannot overcome natural laws, merely bend them occasionally. Every time we wander outside the cave, we're tempted to follow a diversion, be it UFOs, occult or conspiracies. But ultimately, we must return. So if I'm to live my life within the cave, why would I not proclaim my faith? For when we have truly considered the alternatives, all we are left with is our faith, which for so many of us means nothing, an existence within the cave, playing the game with all our further. But it is also because we believe what we believe is our reality. So holograms, the electric universe, the universe's information, and the matrix are simply ephemeral mechanisms to help us understand that which science is merely exploring. Nevertheless, if we use the matrix to describe the Higgs field, maybe it is a valid description and would be the ether through which quantum entanglement is transmitted. Having devoted my life to knowledge, often somewhat scientifically, I personally find the universe as information an attractive hypothesis, but science must remain detached from a hypothesis. None can be wrong, for if enough believe in them, then like the flat earth, they're seemingly correct. But do not doubt that they are ephemeral. We have been fed the false belief that we are progressing and evolving. If we see history less deterministically, these are simply metaphors for our age. I am not dismissing these beliefs, simply categorising and contextualising them, as I did with my toy soldiers and was later trained to do. There is nothing superior or clever in what I do, but when I cannot comprehend what is happening, categorising is such a natural reaction for me. I would also wish to distance myself from any religious release which but deny another's, and include in this all forms of evangelism. So do not believe that when we reject aspects of the New Age and occult, it is because I have anything in common with these messianic beliefs. No, I'm a Sufi. He dips into Kajawan, esotericism and the New Age, but it will always return to Islam. In my journey, I've rejected my left-leaning utilitarianism and even moral relativism. So do not mistake my thoughts as revolutionary sentiment, for they no longer are. No, I express a concern for humanity based on religion and moral conviction, because religion and not politics, however radical, is our last opposition to the advance in Armageddon. For every act of hate begins with self-hate. To hate anything superimposes a person's perceptions on the universe, which, like desires, if carried into death, will remain. At my Church of England primary school, I was taught that two wrongs don't make a right, that the pen is mightier than the sword, and many other cliches. Bloody revolution and retribution merely compound the wrongs in our universe, externalising the evil and seeking to replace it with good, in the mistaken belief that our struggle with evil can be concluded. Indeed, revolutionary Marxism is ultimately the most materialist of science and therefore the most pervasive hegemony. It focuses attention on the greed of the capitalist, which indeed they are, but fail to see it as a symptom and not a cause. Even protests, either peaceful or violent, only serve to legitimise that which we protest against. Life is not a battle but a game which intellectually and physically we must free ourselves from and surround ourselves with love. For our journey is an evolution and not a revolution. I no longer seek to expose conspiracies, but have a duty to do so when I trip over them. For those who focus too long on the wrongs of the elite and conspiracies fill their hearts with hatred and become little better themselves. I remember being impressed by the anarchist adage, "Don't vote, it only encourages them." Well, now I'm saying, don't play, it only perpetuates the game. Or even, don't care, it only feeds them. A long time ago, I recall saying to Pa Angabaya that we hadn't chosen to play with piety, but now we were in a game I intended to win. Well, now I realised that if we don't play the game really does end. So the means justifies the end. After all. Remember, we are what we think. So stop playing the game, and eventually it no longer exists. We come to the point of realising the selfishness of not playing, because it is our way of saying, my game is superior to yours. So we must resist pride and selfishness. For this also re-engages us. Then if in doing this we escape this game and find ourselves in another, what should we do? Certainly not playing and loving, as this is the end of our consciousness, will triumph, or at least we will gain more knowledge of ourselves and God. Based on the Skinner box, we are given shallow rewards like shopping at regular intervals. After all, humans are ritual beings, which fail to satisfy us, but are enough to maintain our behaviour and keep us playing. Such is our behavioural conditioning. Or maybe the point of the game is to learn the metaphor of the game and to realise that if we approach things as a game, it'll bring us closer to God. So ridding ourselves of selfishness, pride and greed, the ego which is the symptoms, which are all symptoms of fear, we may not be ending the game, simply closer to reaching our purpose. In fact, my experience is that we're in a constant feedback loop, that we stop playing and change the game just a little, but this is our fate, to make incremental changes and to not get sucked into the game, back into the game, and it's all our horrors. But either way, whether it is the end of the game or a strategy within the game, it really doesn't matter, as I truly suspect, because where we place our intention, energy flows. Then once we can do this, we will have laid the foundations of Jerusalem amongst these dark satanic mills. All that I have learned over the past 2 years suggests that the game is indeed a metaphor, and that the game within the game simply an intellectual riddle. If we use love and happiness to neutralise the effects of the game the elite play on us, it matters not whether we actually escape the game. It is just important for us to recognise that it's only a game. So we control our emotions, our highs and our lows, whatever good or bad fortune is sent, as it's only a game. I early on realised that the tricks one can learn within Conjowan are just these tricks, despite my Dukan brother being so enamoured by them. So why have I been so slow to realise that so too is imposing your will on others and the universe? Complete control means a knowledge of the future, and therefore the future becomes the past, because we already know it. So the universe is devoid of wonder. We must reject the offer of power and control, as this is yet another device to keep us playing and divert us from what our real purpose is, an offer that the elite have not learned to reject, which is the very reason they deserve our sympathy and not our contempt. But maybe you can allow yourself to not be impressed by their large homes, yachts, supercars and the other trinkets as you turn your backs on consumption and Baudelaire's hyper-realism. But if you focus strongly enough on the non-material world, even the large homes, yachts and supercars, along with the elite who suppress us, may disappear, for there are happier realities in which they don't exist. Thus we find ourselves choosing to step back into the cave, somewhat knowing some of what is outside, but recognising that true power comes from rejecting all that is on offer. We simply thank God each day for what we have and our abundance, and we find happiness and move towards the oneness. For spiritual development contains the truth of true religion. But some months later, I'd moved from these thoughts and realised that the game is a mere metaphor within the stage of my consciousness awakening. If I'm correct, that all the challenges and indeed ephemeral rushes of happiness are designed to keep me playing, or more correctly, to prevent my consciousness from moving to an even higher level. Those readers who have followed each of my episodes will recall I questioned if my problems were a response to my new faith. Of course they were, and also a response to my search for happiness, as everything has an equal and opposite reaction. So Nietzsche was correct, that we do have to experience sadness to experience happiness, but not necessarily in the order he believed. Unconditional love is not the only response to the original setbacks, but also those which keep occurring. Indeed, their occurrence is an affirmation that you are getting close to a state of bliss. Not only have I forgiven everyone, including myself, but I have to take a disinterest in these events, seeing them as a distant observer and not a participant. But to reach another level, I have to give up on the quest for meaning, as there is no meaning. I'm not here to learn a lesson, nor discover the meaning of life, simply to set my own agenda based on love and not fear, and to follow it. I'm now regularly addressed as Pade, so whilst I may never become Indonesian, maybe it is possible to become Javanese. Certainly my experiences and attitudes towards them now mark me out from other bules in Java, and I am often called Londo, a corruption of Hollander. Without mass predictor, I am sweeping the leaves in my garden and lighting fires with them. I might not grow a moustache, but in many other respects I've become Javanese. Of course, people from the Desa will never come to me for my newfound knowledge of Javanese mysticism, but the tarot provide me with a Western technology to integrate into the Desa. No one in the Desa had ever heard of tarot before, but are completely accepting of the card's ability to predict the future. But perhaps the most significant adaptation is that Mas Perwa's family now come to me from Jammu, and even explained to Pekano that he did not need to prescribe herbs for his diagnosis, as they already found my Jammu to be highly effective. Whilst Melly is busy cooking and baking, to the amazement of the Desa, who had assumed that she could do neither. We will always be different from others in the Desa, but we're no longer outsiders and form an integral part of daily life here in Gunung Kidul. Well, that's the final chapter of my third book, The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge. I have to be honest with you that at the time of recording this, I have not yet started writing a fourth book, although I can feel one coming. Nevertheless, I'm unsure if on this channel what I will do next will be to publish my fourth book, or to take extracts from these three books and put them into smaller chunks for people to listen to. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you want to find out and get notification of what I'm about to do next, then please hit the subscribe button, and I believe you've got to hit the bell as well, and that way you'll get to hear of what I issue next. But definitely I'll keep doing things, and thank you so much for listening. Really, thank you.